400 blue iguanas now sunbathe across the reserves of Grand Cayman Island. 20 years ago, there were fewer than 25 left on the entire planet. That number should terrify anyone who understands extinction math. Fewer than 25 individuals is not a struggling population, it's a countdown. And yet, somehow, this 5-foot reptile, found nowhere else on Earth, didn't just survive. It came back 15 times over. Here's what makes it stranger. The threat wasn't hunters, and it wasn't some catastrophic storm. It was smaller than that, barely noticeable, in fact. Stray dogs, feral cats, rats that had hitched a ride to the island generations earlier. None of them were built to hunt a 5-foot lizard, but they didn't need to. They only needed to find the hatchlings. Grand Cayman's largest native land animal was being erased one baby at a time, so quietly that for years, almost no one realized it was happening. By the time scientists understood the scale of the collapse, there was no time left for half measures. So they made an unusual decision: pull the last wild individuals in and buy them 2 years. Just 2 years, because 2 years was the exact threshold where a blue iguana stops being prey and starts being untouchable. It worked, but not in the way anyone expected. Because raising a generation of iguanas in captivity was never the hard part. The hard part was what happened after they were set free. Into an island that had changed in ways the scientists hadn't fully accounted for, alongside a population of invasive lizards that outnumbered them by the millions. What they discovered next would determine whether this species had a future at all, or whether Grand Cayman's most remarkable comeback story was about to hit a wall no one saw coming.
Welcome to The Rewilding, where we uncover what is and what was. Subscribe if you want more stories like this.
Picture Grand Cayman before any of this scrubland stretching to the coast, and moving through it, the island's largest native land animal, Cyclura lewisi, the blue iguana, growing past 5 feet long. For centuries, it had no real predators. It didn't need to be fast or cautious. It just needed to exist. Then the island started to change. Roads cut straight through its territory. Iguanas do what they've always done: stretch out on warm, open surfaces to regulate their body heat. Except now those surfaces carried traffic. Adults that had survived decades were killed in seconds. But the roads weren't even the real problem. The real problem showed up on 4 legs, and it wasn't dramatic. Feral cats, stray dogs, rats that arrived generations earlier and never left. None of them were hunting adult iguanas. They didn't have to. They went straight for the hatchlings before they were ever big enough to fight back. An entire generation was disappearing before it had a chance to grow up. And by the time anyone measured the damage, the species wasn't just declining. It was down to single digits, and standard conservation laws weren't going to save it. By the time single digits stopped being a metaphor and became a literal headcount, half measures were off the table. That's when the Blue Iguana recovery team was formed, not to study the decline further, but to intervene directly, immediately, and aggressively. Their strategy came down to one number: 2 years. That's how long it takes a blue iguana to grow past the size where a cat, a dog, or a rat sees it as an easy meal. So the team built a program around that single window, pulling hatchlings out of the wild, raising them in captivity, and giving them exactly what nature no longer could: time. This wasn't meant to be permanent protection. It was armor with an expiration date, designed to hold juveniles just long enough for their own bodies to become the real defense. Once an iguana crossed that 2-year threshold, it could walk back into the same landscape that had been killing its species for a decade and simply be left alone. The concept was sound, the execution deceptively simple. But as the first head-started iguanas neared release, researchers realized survival in captivity was the easy part. What waited outside those enclosures was a threat no one had fully planned for. By the time the first head-started iguanas were ready for release, Grand Cayman itself had changed, and not in their favor. Decades earlier, another iguana had arrived on the island, the common green iguana, iguana. It wasn't native. It wasn't rare. And by now, it wasn't in the dozens or hundreds, it numbered in the millions. For a species clawing its way back from 25 individuals, sharing an island with millions of a related lizard should have been catastrophic. Same habitat, same sunlit clearings, same trees for shelter. Conservationists feared the worst outcome imaginable: hybridization, the slow genetic erosion of a species until Blue Iguana stopped meaning anything distinct at all. So they tested it. The results surprised even the researchers. Genetic analysis confirmed that despite living side by side, competing for the same space, the Blue Iguana simply does not interbreed with its green invasive cousin. Millions of neighbors and not a single blurred bloodline. The species' genetic identity remained untouched. With that threat ruled out, conservationists could finally move forward with confidence. But genetic purity meant nothing if these young giants couldn't survive the wild on their own terms. That test was still ahead. With genetic identity confirmed, the next question was simpler, but far higher stakes. Where do you put a species you're trying to rebuild from scratch? The answer was 3 sites: Queen Elizabeth II Botanic Park, Salina Reserve, and Collier's Wilderness Reserve. Not chosen at random, but engineered as protected strongholds, each one shielded from the roads, the development, and the predators that had nearly ended the species in the first place. Head-started iguanas, now past their 2-year threshold, were released in stages. Biologists tracked every stage of what came next. Did they establish territory? Did they hold it? Did they survive their first wild season? They did. And then something happened that no captive breeding program can force. The iguanas began reproducing entirely on their own. Wild hatchlings, born to wild parents, with no human hand involved. That single detail changes everything about what this program actually is. It was never built to breed iguanas forever. It was built to reach 1,000 self-sustaining wild individuals, and then shut itself down completely. As those wild-born hatchlings kept appearing across the reserves, something else became clear. This wasn't just recovery. It was the early shape of a milestone decades in the making. Every wild-born hatchling was a data point. Together, they added up to something conservation biologists rarely get to witness. A species pulled back from the edge, verified not by hope, but by numbers. The IUCN Red List took notice. Officially, the Blue Iguana's status shifted from critically endangered, the classification just one step from extinct in the wild to endangered. On paper, it's one category. In practice, it's a species that stopped being a countdown. And here's the detail that reframes everything you've heard so far. Blue iguanas can live past 60 years, which means some of the original individuals, the actual survivors pulled from the wild back in 2002, when the entire global population barely cleared 25, are still alive today, still in the reserves, still breeding. They are, quite literally, watching their own species come back from the brink they nearly disappeared into. For Grand Cayman's largest native land animal, that's not just a recovery. It's a founder generation witnessing its own legacy unfold in real time. But this story was never just about one lizard on one island. What happened here would go on to reshape how conservationists think about saving species everywhere. Here's what the Blue Iguana's recovery actually protected, once you step back far enough to see it. Not just a lizard, a landscape. Because to save this animal, conservationists had to save its habitat, and habitat doesn't recognize species boundaries. The scrubland set aside for the Blue Iguana also sheltered native plants that had nowhere else to grow. It gave cover to birds that nested in that same brush. It preserved soil, insects, entire food webs that had no headline of their own, no recovery plan, no name on the IUCN list. Grand Cayman didn't just save a reptile, it saved a piece of itself. That's the part that's easy to miss. When people talk about endangered species, they talk about the animal, the number, the population count, the milestone. But a single species is rarely isolated. Save the umbrella species, and everything sheltering beneath it gets saved too, whether anyone was watching for it or not. Land that could have become resorts, roads, another stretch of coastal development, it's scrubland instead. Quiet, intact, doing what scrubland has always done. So maybe the real lesson isn't about iguanas at all. It's about how much we assume is already lost before we've actually checked. 25 individuals looked like an ending. It was a beginning that hadn't been written yet. Which raises a question worth sitting with. How many species, how many landscapes have we quietly written off simply because no one asked whether they still had time? If stories like this matter to you, subscribe and join us as we uncover how animals continue to reshape the world around us.